And we are live. Great. So today we're going to talk about CSS Grid, which is a pretty exciting new development in the front end world. It's been a long time coming. So I'll walk us through a little history lesson, and then we'll play with some code pens and see what we can do with the CSS Grid. So switch to screen sharing here. We probably all remember these days. Back when we laid out our HTML pages with tables. And that was really when the web started. It was not designed for complex layouts. It was designed for simple documents. And this was the most powerful tool we had to lay out those documents. That got old pretty quick. It was semantically pretty gross. It made these documents really hard to parse. Although it was kind of nice for dealing with grids, I have to say. But yeah, it was not intended for that ever. So then we started to use floats more often to deal with layout. And floating was great for, hey, I have this image and I need to sit next to some text, or hey, I have a little like pull quote. I need that to sit to the right of some text. It worked for that. Once you started trying to do more complex things, however, that got pretty nasty. So then somewhere along the line, we got Flexbox. Flexbox gave us a lot more power over a single row of elements. So you can stack them to the left, to the right. And of course, it wasn't using left or right. It was start and end. So they were multi-language friendly. Left to right languages could still deal with this. And then it gave us a lot of control over spacing, over ordering. Basically, Flexbox was big, and we use Flexbox pretty heavily in our projects right now. But the downside is Flexbox is really made for working in one direction. It's a one-dimensional layout tool. So I have a code pen here that I was working on recently, working on some header stuff. It's showing some Flexbox concepts like flex wrap, the way we justify, these flex elements that describe the proportions in which these things grow. So these grow proportionally. Those same concepts apply to CSS Grid. But what's so interesting about CSS Grid is that now we're working in 2 dimensions instead of 1. And that's what makes it so powerful. So let's look at good old can I use. So CSS Grid rolled out in its kind of final state in most of the major browsers, I believe in March of this year. You can see IE had an implementation of CSS Grid, but it was not the final implementation. So if you're working with IE 11, CSS Grid is not really an option without a fallback. But Modern Edge is compatible with the CSS Grid implementations in Firefox and Chrome and Safari and all that good stuff. And if you're using Opera Mini, I'm sorry. Hopefully you'll get something soon. So let's look at some CSS Grid concepts. This is from Rachel Andrews' site, Grid by Example, which I highly recommend as an amazing resource to learn about CSS Grid. She's laid out a bunch of concepts and tons of examples and patterns to work from. So here are a few basic concepts is when we have this layout grid, grid lines are, as you can see, that red spot. Tracks are an important new thing. Those you can kind of think of as the domain that Flexbox lived in. Is you have one dimension that you're working along that track. A cell is an individual piece, and then an area is a 2-dimensional piece. So I made a code pen that we could play with some of these things. I went ahead and skipped straight to probably what is my most, like the part of CSS Grid that I'm most excited about, which is named grid sections. So here we've got this code pen. The markup is super simple. This is a layout that you might see quite often with a header and a footer and some sidebar and a content area. And let's see what we can do with this. So in this CSS, I have this container that probably how I would have done this with Flexbox is to do, I have this, maybe this big container, and then I have probably my header. Actually, I'll just copy this over. Easier. But what I'd probably do is have then this kind of like wrapper right here that needs to be around the sidebar and the content, so that with Flexbox, I can describe that the sidebar and the content belong in the same row most of the time. And I won't deal with responsive behaviors too much in this talk, just because that's a whole nother can of worms that I love, but we'll avoid that for today. So the really interesting thing here is the grid template areas. So we can actually kind of treat the CSS we're writing here as sort of a visual layout engine, which is super cool. Not something we've really ever been able to do before. And so I've defined template areas. Those template areas are header, sidebar, content, and footer. And then what I've done is, hey, I said there's 3 columns in this grid, and they're each 20 ends wide, actually. Can kind of get rid of that. We'll just do 100%. So because there's 3 columns, they're each 33.3%. We let the browser handle all that math. And then for each of these grid template areas, I need to define, or actually, I've defined them here, sort of, but then say that, hey, this header uses grid area header. The sidebar uses grid area sidebar, and so on. And so by playing with this kind of visual layout engine, I can change things a little bit. So let's say that, like, I actually want the sidebar to be a little wider. So we're going to have the sidebar take up 2 of those columns. Hey, look at that. Now it's taking up 2 to the contents 1. Switch that back. Or what if I just take out this footer section? What's going to happen? Interesting. All right. And then if I reduce it down to a single footer, we get all kinds of gnarly things happening. So that's a lot more power than we've ever had within our CSS. And it's very declarative, which is nice. So instead of having to kind of manage each of those things within each declaration, we can manage the entire layout in one place, which is pretty awesome. So a few other things I wanted to show off that you can do with this. You can have your columns be a fixed width. So we're dealing with like 20 M columns there. Probably in most of the layouts that I foresee myself building with this, I will not want to have explicit column widths like that. I'll probably want to have it a lot more flexible and make it all proportional to fill up the screen. But if you're working with say a content site that has like long form articles where you want to optimize for reading, which is not an app that we work on, the type of thing that we work on most of the time, then that might be a case where you want a max width and explicit column widths, so that you have a lot more control over the text width and how that thing reads. So here's another cool thing that we can use is grid gap. We can have the grid itself manage margin and padding, basically, and we're not having to explicitly create those in each place. So now we've got some grid spacing going on there without having to call for like padding in here, which is pretty cool. So that really wraps it up. This was a quick one. I want to show off grid template areas, which are really, really cool and hope to be using pretty soon. The kind of the right strategy right now with CSS Grid, because a lot of projects are still supporting IE11, and probably will be for another year or two at least, is to go ahead and start using CSS Grid, but with Flexbox fallbacks. And that works out pretty well. And luckily, IE11's Flexbox implementation is pretty okay. So you'll be all right taking that approach. We got any questions from the front side folks dialed in?
You may have said this, and I might have missed it, but for the grid template areas, is there like a maximum kind of length that those can be?
So a maximum.
So you have header, header, header. Could you have like header 10 times?
Oh, yeah, you could. I think there is probably a max of how many columns you can do, but I think it's a lot. So and usually if you're dealing with a grid that has that many columns, you're not going to want to use these like named template areas. You're going to rely more on just pure math to deal with that grid.
Can you nest?
Or you could probably name them with like single letters, even if you really wanted to fit a lot in there.
That's true. You could, yeah. Yes, you can nest. So what you can do is actually, I don't think you can nest like within the template areas declaration here. I could be wrong about that. But one of the cool things that Grid lets you do is if you have like, let's say you wanted to have inside of the content, you want to treat content as its own like grid container. You could do that, and then its children will actually like know the context of the outer grid, and so you can do calculations. So like, let's say that you have 12 column is a pretty typical layout back from the 960 grid days. 12 columns just kind of works well on the web. So let's say you have a 12 column layout and the sidebar is like 3 and the content's 9. You could have children of the content that know that this is 9 columns and know what the size of those columns and the larger grid are and calculate off of that, which is pretty cool. Flexbox doesn't really have that power.
This is really cool.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to be the impact of CSS Grid on frameworks like Bootstrap and Foundation and Bulma and Skeleton and all these things? Do you think they're going to then go and re-implement and leverage CSS Grid, or is it going to phase those out and people are just going to start using CSS Grid without using those sort of frameworks?
I'm betting that frameworks like Bootstrap and Foundation, I think, have a long shelf life still, and it's likely that their CSS grids will just kind of be re-implemented using CSS Grid. I believe that one or both of those two is already using Flexbox as an implementation for its grids, but they'll probably just go all the way. But really, this removes the need to use any kind of grid system. You can kind of roll your own each time really quickly without needing to use a pre-built grid system like that. It's really just built in the browser now. You don't have to go out and use something like that anymore. There's still a lot of utility with Bootstrap and Foundation in using their like buttons and input styles and forms and stuff like that. I love on new projects falling back to like Bootstrap's form styles. That gets you really far really quickly with some attractive styles. But yeah, the grid pieces, I think just you won't even need anymore.
Does CSS Grid have any support for asymmetrical grids that you know of?
Asymmetrical grids. Oh, so like
grid layouts.
So if you want to do like offsets?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
Yes. I don't know how to do that off the top of my head, but yes.
Probably like each like grid area takes up 2 cells, and then in the offset row, you just offset by 1 cell.
Gotcha.
Let's try it. So what if we had something like a dummy here? We could do that. There's probably a cleaner way to do it though than just throwing in an unnamed thing in there.
Cool.
Nice. All right. That's a short little primer on CSS Grid, and hopefully we'll get to use this on some stuff soon.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Everybody have a good one.
Yep. Happy New Year, everybody.
Oh yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, Jeffrey. See y'all.
Yep.